All right. So, back again. Number 8. We are actually somewhat making progress through this series. And once again, very rich lecture here. And I did want to throw this out as a reminder. I think that our commentaries here are mostly for people who have already seen the lecture, right? I mean, it's going to be, it's going to be very difficult to follow if somebody's trying to pick this up without having actually talked to. So anyway, you said, yeah. So anyway, you said you had the summary this time, so I'll let you
I'll
jump
do the
out
summary
ahead.
this time. Yep. All right. So, for this lecture, I think it's important to make sure before getting into it that we understand the concept of existential modes, because this is something that was mentioned in the end of lecture 7. So let's quickly rehash that, because it's very dependent. Lecture 8 heavily depends on this idea, and I'm sure that this idea will be developed even further. So existential modes refers to what he refers to as agent-arena coupling. So to put this idea into oversimplistic terms, an existential mode is kind of like living your life in a role. And again, this is an oversimplification, but the agent, which is you, fits in well with the arena, which is a theater in which the agent operates. And if there's a good fit between agent and arena, then you have attained what Vervaeke refers to as a nomological order. Existence makes sense to you because you fit well into the arena. However, he develops the idea of existential modes even further. We have two kinds of modes, a having mode and a being mode. The having mode is a state in which you interact with the arena in a somewhat superficial and visceral way. And this is my interpretation of the having mode. The analogy that comes to mind is how one might treat a sexual partner in a being mode versus a having mode. So when you have sex just to have sex, you're in a having mode. You're driven by basic desires, whereas if you approach your partner in a being mode, you are engaged with the partner in a deeper, more reciprocal relationship. You are not just using your partner to have them, but you're making something together. You're making a relationship. And one way this is contrasted is the difference between the terms having sex and making love, right? So lecture 8 starts with the biography of Siddhartha, who grew up in an opulent palace where all of his desires and wants were provided for. And Vervaeke argues that this part of the myth illustrates Siddhartha living exclusively in the having mode. And when he ventures out of the palace and he sees a sick person and a dead person, his perception of how the world works is shattered. He realizes that the arena that he's in is wrong, so to speak. If sickness and death can befall even Siddhartha, the son of the king, then his having mode, which forms the entirety of his existence up to that point, the entirety of his existential mode, it makes no sense. It's absurd. He's disillusioned. The having mode is a construct that will fail for Siddhartha when sickness and death come for him. And he has what Vervaeke refers to as modal confusion. He has too much of the having mode, and he has none of the being mode. His visits out of the palace also put him into contact with a mendicant, in whose eyes Siddhartha sees peace, despite the mendicant living a life of abstinence and self-denial. And it points out to him that there's another way to be. There's another existential mode out there. So Siddhartha leaves the palace and tries to explore other ways of being that seem less absurd than the palace life. So Vervaeke contends that Siddhartha, what he's trying to do is to try to resolve his modal confusion. Through extreme self-denial, he tries to get into the being mode, but he fails, because extreme self-denial is also a having mode in its own right. Self-denial is the negation of self-indulgence, and it is not the transcendence of it. And actually, this reminded me of the line from The Matrix, the great philosophy, movie, when Neo asks Morpheus, so you're saying that I can dodge bullets? And Morpheus responds by saying, no, I'm saying that when you're ready, you won't need to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. Great.
So the analogy on how to live well is illustrated in the strings of the lyre. It's lyre, right? That's the pronunciation.
Lyre.
of
Lyre.
Lyre.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
Lyre, liar. So the strings are neither too tight nor too loose. You're able to accommodate
Yep.
and not negate your having mode with your being mode, and both can be in harmony like a well-tuned lyre. This middle path allows Siddhartha to reconnect with his having mode. It allows his consciousness to bring this mode into mind. And to drag Plato and Aristotle here, he's able to conform his mind to the eidos of the being mode. And this state of mind is referred to as sati, which means to remember, to return to, and to wake up into the having mode. The word
The
sati has
being
been
mode.
translated into,
Yeah.
being mode, yes.
Yep.
The word sati has been translated into mindfulness, but the term doesn't quite entirely capture the depth of the experience that is being discussed here. So he takes a sidestep here, leaving the mythology of the Buddha, and focuses on the subject of mindfulness for the rest of the lecture. And he tells us that we get confused about mindfulness because we focus on the feature list and not the feature schema, which, by the way, is a very excellent model of thinking
Great.
about, ideas, feature
Sure.
list versus the schema. And he uses the analogy of the memory palace, which is a mnemonic technique for memorizing vast amount of information, a powerful tool that allows us to remember a vast amount of things, but it doesn't do anything to help us understand how memory in the brain works from a neurochemical, neurophysiological perspective. And people make the same kind of mistake with mindfulness. People give us a list of the things that mindfulness is. It's being present in a non-judgmental way that leads to insight and decreased reactivity. But this list of things doesn't actually explain mindfulness in much the same way that the memory palace doesn't explain how memory works. So for the last part of the lecture, he takes a deep dive into unpacking one element of mindfulness. And this, the first one he tackles is the idea of attention, and tells us that the word concentrate or the phrase pay attention is problematic because it isn't precise enough and it doesn't come with any further instruction. It doesn't have that feature schema. So to pay attention, he says, isn't to just cast a spotlight on some object of attention, but it is more of a soft vigilance, an exploration of the focus of attention by the mind, a continual effort of what he calls renewing interest in the object of meditation. He refers to the term inter-es, which is to be within something, and in this, and to be within something, the something he refers to the object of meditation. And then he ends by saying that further lectures, I think the very next one will explore how the elements of what is known as mindfulness actually interoperate, how they relate to each other, and how they then eventually allow us to resolve our modal confusion and get back into this sort of state of sati, which is to remember and return to the being mode. So that's sort of my summary of the lecture.
Yeah. I think what's interesting, great summary. Yeah. I think what's interesting is I was actually, as I was going through this, struggling to even know how to engage with this discussion. What I'd like to do is almost do a retelling of that summary, but not from a different point of view, but maybe just in terms of my commentary, and maybe we can leap off from there.
Sure.
So a couple of aspects that popped out to me now that you've summarized it, I think. One is that understanding what you said, that we need a balance between the having mode and the being mode. And so while sati is about recovering the lost mode of being, right, it is not about transitioning completely from having to being. It is the middle path, right? The having is too hard, the being is too soft, or vice versa, and we're trying to find the middle path. So yes, we need to recover the being mode, and while maybe we are working on recovering that, we are letting the having mode sort of, our focus is not on the having mode. We're trying to recover that lost being, right? Being mode. But the ultimate goal is to walk the middle path of both. And I think that's an important distinction, because I think a lot of people maybe who are really getting into mindfulness try to make too far of a transition. They forget that it is the middle path, right? You're not supposed to be like floating on a cloud all the time, right? Like, so that's one thing. I think the other one that really struck me, and again, this difference between having and being is sort of central to the whole thing. But one of the things he said about what the having mode is that it's categorical, and that it's about using and manipulating, right? So if the example he gave in the previous lecture was that of a cup, right? What makes a cup a good cup? Well, it reminds me of all the other cups because it has the eidos of a cup, right? So it fulfills the category of the cup, and I can use it. I know how to use it and manipulate it to serve the functions of the cup, right? Very different from being in love with someone or being in a relationship with someone, where the example he gives, you can't say, well, the reason I value you as a partner is because you remind me of all the other women I've been with, and I know how to use and manipulate you, right? I do a little bit disagree, though, and I'll expand that a little bit further, is that we do have needs, right? And that's a bit of the having mode, is I need air, I need water, I need food, right? I need sex, and in a way, I need love, right? We are social creatures. And those are the having aspects of those things, right? But there is, to some degree, a being aspect of each of those, right? So being, I do need love, and to some degree, there's an aspect where I need a circle of friends, right? I need a relationship, right? And there's a degree to which, with anyone, right? However, then in the being mode, there is also the nature that we have a relationship between us that is individual, unique, and special, right? If I'm in a partnership, merely the fact that this person is a stand-in for whoever I need as a girlfriend or a partner is not enough. There needs to also be a being mode version of that, where the individuality of that experience is there, right? You could also say the same thing, is I do have a libido. I do have a sex drive. I need to have sex. And there's a degree to which, with anyone, right? However, that if I left it there, I would be missing a huge portion of what's available through the sexual experience, because there needs to be lovemaking. There needs to be a sexual interaction with a unique individual in a long-term relationship, for me at least, right? That being mode. So again, it's not just about switching. One's not better. It's about the middle path, right?
Yeah.
I'll take that further. I think that there is an aspect where I need food, right? To live, I need to have food, and merely self-denial, as we talked about, is not you're still in the having mode, right? However, that is different than savoring food, savoring a great meal, right? Savoring the making of a great meal for someone you love. Those are all deeper experiences that incorporate into the mere, I need to have dinner tonight, right? Like, and to some degree, any dinner will do. I can order Chipotle and I often do, right? I just have food, right? But then there is the separate experience of savoring a phenomenal meal, right? And I'm going to come back to that word savoring, I think, a bit as well. I think you can extend that pretty far. The words that come to mind for the being mode, just like the words use and manipulate were used for having, the words enjoy and explore came to mind for being, the being mode, right? And that is to have your interest constantly renewed in the thing that you are being with, right? Being in love, for instance, right? Versus having love, right? I wanted to make a couple commentaries as well on things that we've touched on in different circumstances. We've noticed, both of us, I think, that in the world there is perhaps a pattern of growing sort of victim mentality, right? And I think that one of the ways of framing that is that if you frame the notion of having power versus being powerful, or right, the notion of having control versus being in control of yourself, right, of the things that are within your control, and if all of life is merely a matter of oppression or if blaming others for what you don't have, right, or for the tragedies of your life, you're in the having mode rather than trying to recover this being mode of being yourself. I think that comes down to this notion of identity we've talked about, right? I think people are trying to have an identity, and they do that by, or having a sense of self, and they do that by sinking into some group, right? I'm Muslim, I'm whatever, black
Vegan.
person, I'm a vegan, I'm right, I'm whatever, LGBTQ, whatever it is. I sink into an identity, or an identity, by trying to have one, and that's very different than being yourself, right? There's one aspect. If you have an identity, you know yourself intellectually. That's the intellectual knowing, right? But when you're being yourself, that is the participatory knowing. That is doing the things that you do, right? And savoring those things. Feeling knowing what it is like to be yourself, right? So that's one. The other one that obviously hits close to home is, on some level, the notion of having health versus being healthy, right? And I think that a lot of the tech bro biohacking stuff that I argue against, and that we notice, the Brian Johnson morons of the world, is about having health and approaching health from a having standpoint. Whereas being healthy, to some degree, is not trying to negate the tragedy of death. It is accepting aging, mortality, and enjoying and exploring your own health. Doing things that allow you to feel the health within you in some sense, whether that's mental health or physical health. And again, I think that requires some sense of purpose or meaning in order to be healthy in that way. So making that switch, I think, is a large part of what I struggle with in the practice. You also touched on the notion of conformity. And I'm throwing all these concepts because it's just like a ton of stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a lot.
But so when you make bread, one of the issues learning to make bread is that you can watch all the YouTube videos in the world, but there is a feel to it. There's just a sense of touch. There is a knowing of how to fold the bread, how to move the bread in such a way that it is, and so many, and the people talk, that are into this, they talk about this in other terms that have the same quality. They call it the lover's touch, right? Which Esther Perel also talks about in the relationship. It is that it is firm but not forceful. It's decisive but not hesitant, but also not rough, right? And this is bread making, right? But eroticism has that same challenge, is that there is the not too soft, not too hard concept. And to me, that is on some level the essence of conformity, right? If you are too hard, you cannot conform to the thing you are trying to form to, right? If you are too soft, if you're completely just like water, then you just adopt the shape of the thing. Like you're not, there's no you there, right? And that conformity is sort of a blend between those two. It's the lover's touch, where your hand conforms to the body of your lover, or to the bread, or to whatever it is that you're engaging with. The other example that comes to mind, I did ballroom dance actually, and enjoyed that at one time. And one of the things that's taught is you have to, as the man especially, you have to maintain a frame, but the woman also has to as well. And so as you hold your partner, you both have to be slightly pushing against each other. You can't collapse into each other, right? But you also can't be so distant that you can't feel each other, right? The reason you have to sort of be pushing against each other is because that enhances the sensitivity. That creates enough firmness that when I move, she can feel the movement. If she completely collapses when I move, she can't follow my lead. Because I move and her arm completely collapses, like I step toward her, she just stands where she is and her frame collapses, right? So there is the correct amount of pressure. There is the not too hard, not too soft sort of concept once again. And I think this comes up so often in situations that are doing based, right? Where there is no substitute in making bread for just making bread. like you just have to do it a certain number of times. So I don't. I mean, I actually have tons more, but maybe if there's, do you want me to just go on or
There is
something
one.
bubble up for you?
Yeah, no. There is one thing that he kind of put it there as almost a throwaway point, which
Yeah.
I think if you double click on, there's much to discuss or think about, which is that part of the mythology of the Buddha was that he had a wife and child at the time that he left the palace,
Mm.
right? And the mythology says that he just up and left. He's like, "Well, I'm out of here, bros," and he just
Yeah.
like leaves the palace. And then the question is, what is the myth saying when it comes to this abandonment of his wife and children? Right? That's a very
Yeah.
powerful thing, right? Like, you have a calling, and you go to your wife and child like, listen, I gotta bounce. I've got a calling, so good luck.
Sure.
And so his answer to that was very profound and something I haven't quite unpacked in my own head just yet, but I want to throw it to you. And the quote is that the myth is saying that the moral life rests on something deeper, that it depends on your life being meaningful, and that meaning in life is different than and deeper than simply living a moral existence. And that's a very profound statement, right? Because like the work of Socrates was, what does it mean to live a good life? And maybe I've always misunderstood this, but whenever I heard the words good life, I always just transposed the words a moral life.
Mm-hmm.
But the mythology of the Buddha says, well, that's not the case. And just it's not just about the moral life. The good life is a life that also feels meaningful. That virtue is also about the meta meaning of your life. So what is your sort of take on this part of the mythology?
I found that fascinating as well. My answer, I disagree, frankly, but in a nuanced way. I understand what he's getting at is that if you're living in a life to the point where you've reached a point of absurdity, right? Like your life feels absurd to you, right? Then yes, to some degree, trying to act virtuously is nearly impossible because all of life seems you're almost hallucinating. It's like you realize you're schizophrenic, right? And you don't know what's real, and so it can be very difficult to figure out how to act morally when you don't even know what is real. You're out of contact with reality. However, so one of my favorite courses in philosophy undergrad actually was a course on meta ethics, right? So there's ethics, which is trying to figure out what is good, what is the moral good, how do we know, right? And meta ethics is why should we care, right? So even if you got perfect knowledge somehow of what was morality, what was the moral set of actions, why is it that you can't just shrug and be like, nah, I don't care? Like, why not? Like, so it's called normative force, right? Why is there an obligation implied by the notion of morality, right? If I tell you that something is morally good and something else is morally bad, right? I'm using the word should in just in asserting that. I'm saying you should do the good and not do the bad. But where does that shouldness come from? That's meta ethics, right? The answer that always appealed to me the most is that regardless of what your moral code is, and that's kind of the interesting thing about metaethics, is it's exploring why any moral code has force, not what the moral code should be, right? But the answer that always appealed to me is that when you violate, even at best, if you violate your own moral code, but if you're a moral realist, then if you violate goodness, moral goodness, right, you fracture your identity, right? Because you start destroying yourself by splitting reality, right? And that itself makes life meaningless. So because you've split yourself multiple times, right? The more you do that, the more you live that way, the more you fracture your sense of self. And given that that's sort of the essence of my perception of metaethics, I disagree somewhat with his commentary that meaning and ethics are hierarchical. I think that ethics actually must be included in any account of meaning. And it's not simply resting on a deeper sense of meaning. And so I think that's something that I disagree with in terms of the myth, from my own perspective.
No, that's that's super interesting. So it almost seems like in that sense the sort of decision to live a moral life is deeply tied into your identity, right? Because you are certain values, right? And what are we if not a constellation and collection of the values that we sort of bring into force, that we embody in the world. So that by that definition, our identity is closely tied to the values that we sort of assert into our lived experience. And if we were just to ignore all moral codes at any time, do whatever we wanted to, we would turn back at some point and ask ourselves, well, what are we really all about, right? Who am I really, right? If I'm not really living by any kind of principle whatsoever, it's all anarchy outside, and therefore anarchy inside. It's all chaos inside.
I mean, if you're going to have an
outside.
agent-arena relationship, you have to bring an agent to the table, like. It can't be a massively fractured, amorphous agent. It needs to be a thing of some kind. There needs to be some thread of consistency, and I think that values create that. Switching gears.
Go ahead if you had any.
Yeah, switching gears just a little bit. I think the one of the other things I thought was interesting, he talked about how the once you are disillusioned with having, right? Once you realize that the having mode cannot fulfill your being needs, right? You realize that and he did that through realizing the reality of suffering. We age, we get sick, we die. Those are inevitable, right? We are not in control of those things. How then could that not destroy our sense of meaning? So, but once an illusion is broken, it's like seeing how a magic trick is done. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to not knowing how the magic trick is done, right? And that irreversibility, I think what's interesting is, Siddhartha tries to return to the palace. That's, to me, very interesting. He rushes back. He tries to recover the old way of being because somehow he thinks, if I can get back to the palace, if I can go back to that place where I was indulged in the having mode, I can unsee what I have seen, right? There is that urge to sort of retreat from the disillusionment, and yet you cannot, right? And I think something that reminded me of is that, like, we again, kind of in the victim mentality that we see in the world, in some sense, it is, well, I see that there is suffering, right? And I want to retreat away from it. I want to have someone to blame, right? Like there is this I'm not sure how to respond to this situation. And in some ways I am being called upon to change my entire being, right? Like and I want to rush back to the security of my previous existential mode, the familiarity of that existential mode. So I don't know. I think that there is that process, I guess, that I see as something inherent to what we're seeing in society. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that that pattern, of rushing back to the palace reminds me of the part of the hero's journey in the very beginning, right, where he rejects the call of the journey.
He rejects
right?
the call.
He
That's
said,
right.
Not for me. And then
That's right.
inevitably that doesn't actually pan out, right? He has to go back. He goes back, something else happens, he probably goes back, and the sense of the absurd, is still highly evident, and then he finally says, okay, I need to leave, I need to get out of here.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The other thing I would mention with the middle path, one of the other things that called to mind as well is Plato's tripartite model of the mind, right? Which you had the man and the lion and the beast, and Plato was like, no, we need to actually have all three work together. Now with Siddhartha, it's more like balance between one extreme and the other extreme, whereas I think Plato was coming up with a different model here, the lion being an extra sort of thing. But if you take the lion out of the picture here, then he's basically just talking about the having mode and being mode, right? So the beast is the having mode and the mind is the being mode. Again, these analogies don't map on perfectly, but
Sure.
directionally they were kind of moving in the same direction there.
Yeah, trying to figure out some similar thing, right? And then the lion to some degree is also the attempt to find a middle path, right? What is that? And it is about connectedness, right? There is that thread that's similar as well. Is that it says the middle path is about getting an optimized type of connectedness. That's a quote that I wrote from Vervaeke, right? And Aristotle had that as well, right? Is that virtue is not either of the extremes. It's in the middle somewhere, right? Courage is a virtue if it's not foolishness and it's not cowardice, right? There's a middle path that makes it a virtue. The other one that came up for me, and I'll quote this a couple times, or the source is Gibran, of course, right? He talks about, or Vervaeke talks about the mendicant in Buddha's experience of the mendicant, and seeing the peace in his eyes. I've always felt that the word peace was a misunderstood word, except by Gibran. So in one of his poems in The Prophet, he asks, what do you have in your houses that you keep and guard with locked doors? Is it peace, that quiet urge that reveals your power? And that's an interesting definition of peace.
I don't get it.
So I think the notion, I think for me, what I hear, and I'm commenting on my own reception of things, but the notion of peace implies an absence of things. It's a negative definition on some level. It is, I am not disturbed, I'm not upset, I'm not reactive, right? And that is framed as peace. Gibran is the only one I've found who provides a positive definition of peace, is that it is a quiet urge that reveals your power, right? That is an interesting definition of peace, that it is not static, it is not flat, right? It is active, it is an urge, it is powerful, right? It is not, and I think that reframing for me captures something that I find myself struggling with in a lot of discussions about meditation, discussions about mindfulness, like peace should, my opinion, peace and mindfulness should not be flat the flat absence of reactivity, right? Peace is being yourself. Peace is engaging with the world in a way that manifests your purpose, and your values, right? Uh, so those visions of what it means to be peaceful, I think, are a bit different. And one of the reasons I disagree kind of with the Buddhist ethic is that definition of peace. I think I define peace differently. And so, again, I think some of the things that, people, he says, oh, he teaches Tai Chi Chuan, right, which is a moving mind, sort of moving mindfulness, right? But if you listen to Joe Rogan talk about jiu-jitsu, he talks about it the same way, right? Is that there's flow in rolling in jiu-jitsu. Most martial arts have that to some degree or another, right? Is you engage in flow as you engage in combat, right? And that is peace, right? It's just not what we think of if we're in the way the conversation usually unfolds. We don't think of combat as a place of peace, of inner peace. But it can be, especially if it's an expression of values, right? Expression of myself, expression of my purpose, right? That I'm, if it's training combat, I'm sparring, I'm rolling in jiu-jitsu, well, I'm expressing my desire to grow, my desire to learn, my desire to my values for those things, to develop myself, right? If we're in real combat on some level, it may be an expression of trying to protect my home, my family, right? Like, and in the practicing, and he talks about practice, right? In the practicing of combat, there is also those values that I want to be able to practice, right? It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, right? I want to be the warrior in the garden and to say I have these skills. But that comes in tons of different ways, right? I think that's part of, for me at least, what we stereotype as the Japanese sort of ethic, which is, I think there's some truth in the stereotype, is whatever you're doing, just do it really well. Do it as best as you can. If you're mopping the floor, don't just mop the floor and have your head somewhere else, right? Mop the floor with intention, put interesse in the floor, right? It's all of life becomes a meditative practice. I mean, I've talked to you so many times about my morning ritual of making myself an espresso, right? It is to me is the essence of mindfulness, is putting myself into the making of the espresso, right? To allow myself to be absorbed, to savor the feel of making the thing, and then to savor the taste of what I've made, right? And so again, that savoring mindset, I think, puts me closer into the being mode, and I would argue is closer to my definition of mindfulness and peace, right? And I think it's interesting that this non-judging thing is also interesting, right? Is that, like, so I'm pulling from multiple sources here, but from the Alcoholics Anonymous literature, they talk about AA is a very spiritual practice. I think we've talked about that a little bit before. And one of the things that they say is that in order to sort of escape the burden of alcoholic addiction through AA or through the spirituality of AA, they say, first of all, we had to stop playing God, right? And there is an aspect of accepting your imperfect control while nonetheless trying to do your best, right? So accepting that, making it a profound example into a trivial one, but if I'm making espresso, sometimes it doesn't go right? Like, even I've done it as perfectly as I can do it with as much attention as I can, and every once in a while, whatever, there's a weird coffee bean in there, there's a weird ground, it doesn't go right, and I have to remake it. I start over, right? Because it does not come out. There is an imperfection in, or as the spiritual light of imperfection says, there is a gap between intention and results, right? and and in that gap is exactly the challenge of even though there's a gap, to nonetheless strive to savor the experience of what you're doing, to do a good job, right? And that was what came to me when he described his finger, right? If I just say, concentrate on my finger, concentrate, right? And I'm just shouting at you, concentrate. Versus if I guide you through savoring the vision of my finger. You can look at my finger and I can say, observe the curvature. Notice the exact framing of the section where each bone has bent the skin. Observe the color differences, right? And suddenly you can be drawn into savoring the vision of my finger, right? Enjoying and exploring the being mode, right? I can explore the nature of your finger. I can enjoy that exploration, right? And I think that those notions for me, whether that's jujitsu or making espresso or making a meal or making love or looking at a finger, I think that recovers the mindfulness of the being mode much more so than sitting in lotus pose and observing my thoughts.
The way that I've always thought about the meditative practice, the Vipassana practice of paying attention to the breath, is that if you can focus your mind, pay attention, quote unquote, to something as subtle and as ubiquitous, something that's present all the time, something you take for granted, like breathing, if you can bring your attention and interest, say, with the patterns of your breathing, then that trains you to be able to do the same thing with other activities and other aspects of your life. So it's not that there's anything magical about the breath, except that it's always available, right? You don't need to go to a temple or get a device, or the breath is always with you. And if you can get that done, if you can train your consciousness to have the ability to interact with something as subtle as your breath, then you are able to then take that tool and transpose it to other things. And I think I've talked to you, I think I called you yesterday and I told you that whenever I meditate a lot, I find that it's much easier for me to read obtuse, difficult text, right? Because my sort of ability to interact, right? My being mode is exercised to some extent, right? Now, you get that same sort of effect from making coffee or, any number of things like martial arts. But I think, thinking of the attention to the breath as being an end to itself is probably an error, right? It's just a tool, right? It's like, okay, practice here, right, with this very subtle thing, and then once you have a gist of what it's like to interact with something, then take that skill set and apply it to making coffee, reading a book, being present with a friend, going for a walk, or any number of things that you do day to day. I think you've expressed some degree of, in the past to me as well, some degree of skepticism almost with the Buddhist practice of meditating. You don't get a lot out of it. I know you've told me that in the past as well. And my rejoinder to you as always has been that it's just it's a memory. No, not a memory. It's a brain training exercise that then you deploy in other arenas as well.
And I can accept it on some level, except my response on some level is, why not just deploy it then on some level? With intention. I savor these podcasts, right? Both the preparation for them, the listening, the planning, writing notes, they're deeply enjoyable and meaningful to explore this. But I also look forward to talking to you, right? You're my best friend. We have a connection. This connects us more. It gives us structure to dive into something we both are fascinated in, right? And so there's layers and layers of fascination, both with the topic and the material, but also with the relationship and the interaction, and with the publication on YouTube and the connection to the business and how this, it's connected to River Rock. So there's so much to be fascinated and interested in this conversation. But if you really look, that's true of a lot of things, from making espresso to, just whatever, walking sometimes, right? I mean, like there's an infinite amount of things to be fascinated and interesse in if you put your mind into it. Most often you can, I mean, not most often, but you can spend a lot of your life that way, really, right? Like just interested in what you're doing at the moment, right? And even if that is planning to do something else, you could be interested in the planning, right? You can be that's sort of being excited about what you're planning, what you're thinking about, right? So
I guess the Vipassana practice is a formalization of that process, right?
yeah,
Is that okay? Yes, you can be interested in planning a vacation and then being on the vacation and then packing your bags and all the rest of it, right? But and this is it was probably true back then, but it's especially true now, where we're really living in a society where everyone has fractured attention because of our digital life and barrage of information that we have to process, whether that's news or Reddit or Twitter or any number of things, right? So the problem that Buddha was trying to solve, or at least in terms of honing our ability to focus, is perhaps far more relevant today than it was back then. But I think it's still a useful it's a useful exercise, right? So it's easy to say, just be interested in your day-to-day life, wipe your hands, and that's your prescription for the rest of your life. But it is also helpful to have a formalized practice, because and I've studied meditation quite a bit and I practice it myself. I have always thought of it as like, okay, I'm sitting down to meditate, but I always tell myself, the frame of mind that you bring to the Vipassana practice, bring that to the rest of your day also. Your meditation doesn't end the minute you're off the chair or the cushion. That's basically just priming your brain so that you can take that energy or that sort of perspective to the rest of the day as well. That's always how I've thought of it, right? And sometimes you need that formal training.
I don't disagree. Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing against it, though. That particular thing, I haven't gotten much out of it, but I guess I would say the value I see in it is in its, well, two things. Number one, in its very triviality, right? The breathing is trivial and a bit boring, really. So learning the process of being interested, being fascinated, savoring and exploring your breath, right? Learning to sink your mind into that experience teaches you that the interest is not in the world. It's not that some other subject is inherently better, right? Like espresso may not be, in fact, better than breath, right? Like you can savor what you're doing, whatever you're doing on some level. I think the other notion that comes to meditation that's subtle and I think under discussed, as far as I can tell, is that you're not comfortable meditating just doing a crappy job, right? People come to meditation in a way that they usually do not approach boring tasks, right? Is with the intention of doing it well, right? I want to do a good job. I want to be good at this, is the subtle underlying whatever. But also I recognize that it's difficult. I recognize that on some level perfection is not possible. I am trying an impossible task, but I want to do it as perfectly as possible. And that balance, I think, very much what I said about espresso, right? Is that how good are you at being interested in your breath, at being to enjoy and explore, to savor the act of breathing, right? Becoming good at that, and I think that what you can bring to the rest of your life is that attitude of wanting to do whatever it is you're doing well, while also having a zoomed out kind of neutral idea of the inherency of not being God, and that you cannot do things perfectly. Sometimes things go astray, and to quote Gibran again, to watch with serenity through the winters of your grief, right? That to have some poise, some equipoise when things go wrong, because they were always going to go wrong at some point. You are not God, right? And so to balance the notion of savoring an experience with the fact that it may not go well, right? It may not, or may not go according to plan. That's also even another subtle thing, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think, and I guess
I
that's
guess
kind of
one
the thing is that,
one
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, one way of maybe perhaps thinking about it again, trying to drag you into accepting the utility of the Vipassana meditation is that it ritualizes and formalizes the practice of the being mode, right? And
Yeah,
so, and I think I've said this to you before as well. I think you do have a greater than average ability to focus and concentrate. And
sure.
I think that you don't understand how mere mortals such as myself struggle with that sometimes, right? And other,
Sure.
and your patients as well, right? I mean, you do have this intellect, right? And this comes with some giant side order of the ability to concentrate endlessly, right? I've seen you do it. So I think what I'm pointing out to you is that that's not most people, right? And I think part of the for example, like you could, read endlessly, large tracts of text. I can't. I struggle a lot with reading obtuse text, and that's why when I meditate and then I find out, I have read, this giant thing of like incredibly boring material, which I need to get through for whatever reason. And it's and I can tell that I'm way better at doing it because I've been meditating the last week or two or whatever it is. I've been in a more meditative state, whereas I think that your ability to do that is already somewhat elevated, so that when you meditate you're not seeing a giant alpha. You're like, nothing is different for me, right?
Yeah.
It's about the same, and you can get into the being mode quite easily when you make espresso. But I've never been able. I mean, I make coffee all the time. I do a French press every day, and it's still, there's a ritual involved. But as when I'm doing it, I'm
Yeah.
thinking about like 10 other things. Like I'm not actually in the moment at all. And for perhaps somebody like myself, the ability to have a ritual that anchors you to what it's like to be in the being mode, or what it's like to be in the present moment, quote unquote, is a useful sort of ritual to have, when it doesn't come easy for me. I mean, just to give you another example that's tangential to this, is I've always said, I don't know how you were able to compartmentalize. You could have some catastrophe going on in your personal life, and then you put a box in it, put it aside, and then you'll work on whatever it is you need to work on. Whereas I've told you before, is like when I have some giant problem I need to solve, it just consumes my consciousness, and it's very difficult for me to compartmentalize. I'm like, I cannot move on until this is resolved, and then it takes up all my energy. And I would argue that that's a lot of people, right? And
Sure.
and I think the same ability you have to compartmentalize and then like deeply focus on what needs to get done for the day.
No, they're the same.
Is also it also comes into bear when you sort of not dismiss the utility of the meditative practice, but you don't find it as useful to you because to a large extent you have the ability to do that anyway. Remember the book we both like, we read a whole bunch years ago, it's by Trevanian, what is it? Shibumi, right?
Yeah.
Shibumi. Yeah. So the character in Shibumi also has this ability to be able to just sort of arrive at nirvana, right? And he was able to do that as a child. And it was only much later, when he was like a teenager, that he found out that other people can't do this. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's an extreme example of what we're discussing when it comes to you. But it's a similar idea.
There is some truth in that, I will say. I'll nuance that in just a second. But certainly, my you've commented many times on my ability to compartmentalize, and you are right. Really, I'm not compartmentalizing. Really, I'm just focusing on whatever else I'm doing to the exclusion of everything else. Like if I'm doing my taxes, 100% of my attention is on doing my taxes at that moment. And so if you know I'm also going through a divorce, I'm not thinking about it at the time I'm doing my taxes. 0% of my mind is on the divorce because I'm doing my taxes, right? And so I tend to do the thing I'm doing with 100% of my attention, and that's not nothing's I'm not perfect at it, but um, I will say I credit my parents a little bit with that because I was not that way as a child necessarily, and I was quite distractible, easily frustrated, did not tolerate boredom very well at all. Um, and I think I've told you the story before, but my classic immigrant parents is, oh, my child is not doing well at paying attention to doing his math homework, right? What does the classic immigrant parent do? They took a TV, they turned it to static, cranked the volume all the way up, and put it behind me and said, "Now do it," right? So, oh, are you struggling with that? Let me make it harder and then do it, right? But there is some truth in that, right? That actually it's it's easier to focus on a difficult task than it is on an easy one, right? And learning to focus on something that absorbs your attention actually gets, in some ways, breath is the hardest, like because it's so trivial that like you're kind of sinking down, right? Um, I guess and so I see the notion that let's start with the hardest thing, right, and then maybe
Yeah.
try and branch out from there. Um,
Maybe a better word is not the hardest thing, but the most subtle thing.
Sure. I guess, and again, the what okay, and I'll just say this is that like the thing that I learned, I think subconsciously that allows that focus is this notion of savoring, right? And even savoring triviality, um, when you learn the skill of savoring, I think then trivialities don't seem trivial. They are interesting, right? Because I am interested, right? And so this brings me actually to the next. And it's a great segue here. Is we talked about the having mode of having control and the being mode to some degree of being in control. I mentioned that in terms of victim mentality and that sort of thing. And depression, in the current model of depression from in the psychotherapy world is learned helplessness, right? Is a perception of not being in control. Um, so the interesting struggle, I think, is specifically on the notion of attentional control. Is can you control what you pay attention to? And that's an interesting thing is when you decide to meditate, you decide, right? You set an intention and you follow through on the notion of paying attention to your breath, right? Or if I make espresso and I do that in a savoring way, I am savoring that experience, right? So I choose to put 100% of my attention on this thing. And that is an assertion of inner control. That is the feeling of being in control of my attention. And so he says that on some level, attention is not under your control. And there's some truth in it's an interesting notion. To me, it feels a little bit like what like controlling a reflex. If you're putting a contact lens in, right? Well, you have a blink reflex the moment you hit your eyelashes, right? But you actually can control that reflex, right? In order to get a contact lens in, you can learn to control involuntary, quote unquote, involuntary muscles, right? So, I think that notion of, I mean, an interesting practice if you is if you're going to talk about breathing, is hypercapnic training, which freedivers do, right? Is learn to tolerate being short of breath, deliberately underbreathe. So not just breathing, but deliberately allow yourself to be a bit air hungry, right? And experience the feeling of that air hunger without gasping, without fixing it, right? Just allow yourself to struggle with it a little bit, right? Anyway, where I was going is that notion of controlling attention, that notion of and even though he says it's not under your conscious control, I would say that he implies that renewing your interest is under your constant control, right? Mm-hmm. There is something you are in control of, and when you learn the skill of controlling your attention, and kind of what we talked about is my parents, I think, very, blessed me with that training lesson to, like, look, you can control your attention. You need to control your attention, right? Distraction is not an option. You need to learn how to pay attention. It has served me really well because I learned to tune things out. I learned to, and it's not, again, we say tune out, but that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm just putting 100% of my interest in the thing, and there's nothing left over, right? To be distracted. And so learning to be interested, to be fascinated, I think that's something you can practice. I think that is something you can intentionally, and you can start with the breath, that's fine. But I think I resonated more and maybe learned more appreciation for the notion of the breathing practices through this lecture, because the notion of being interested in breath, and in my own extrapolation, the notion of savoring breathing, the notion of enjoying and exploring the limits of breathing, kind of like I said, maybe being willingly out of breath, right? And exploring and enjoying the exploration. How much shortness of breath can I tolerate, right? And that's not just holding my breath, but under breathing. So I maintain a constant level of being out of breath, of being air hungry, right? And enjoying pushing my limits, just like I push my limits at the gym, right? And progressively overloading that sense, this is not at all what he talked about, right? But I'm extrapolating dramatically here. But I think that you could approach the process of learning to pay attention, learning to be interested, as a skill, right? And I do think that is a critical and missing skill. We don't teach people anymore. Not maybe we never did in the Western world as well, to be interested, that the world is fascinating if you allow it to be, right? If you are not interested, that's not a commentary on the world, that's a commentary on you. If you're bored, again, especially in today's day and age, like you're scrolling through TikTok, watching dance videos or whatever, you could actually do that with a great deal of interest and pleasure. You could savor, you could learn how to dance, or you could, whatever, just enjoy a hot girl. You could do that in a way that was fulfilling, even though the activity is phenomenally trivial, right? And so you could make anything into a meditative practice. The world is full of things that you could renew your interest in, right? I would say that the more addictive it is, the less effort you have to put into being captivated, right? Like if you're doing meth or cocaine, there's no effort in being captivated, right? You're not learning the skill of captivation. You're not learning the skill of savoring. It's just hitting your receptors so that you're automatically, right? And I would say that's the issue with social media, is that it hits those receptors, and being captivated or savoring that experience doesn't take much learning. You're not learning the skill. Whereas breathing, you have to learn the skill of being interested.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. It's well said. We're hitting on the hour mark here. Are there any other sort of like roads to go down here with this? I know he sort of did unpack what it meant to, pay attention to something. And, I think there was...
So he left on a cliffhanger, by the way, which he unpacked the whole attention thing, and he was like, so we're going to talk about how that leads to insight next time.
I think it's probably good to sort of bring that into the next lecture, just like, sort of how being and having modes was really actually part of the last lecture, but figured heavily in this one. because I think what he's setting us up for is, he did the story of Siddhartha, and he said, okay, let's pause here and let's really unpack what it means to be, what does mindfulness exactly mean. I really do like how he made a distinction between a feature list and a feature schema. This is a useful idea for other things also, right? It's like, oh, okay, this is definitely what mindfulness is, but then how do these different aspects relate to each other? How does one cause the other? What is the causal relationship between these things? I think that's an idea that probably has application in many other concepts, but we could probably have a conversation about what it means to have attention from the perspective of mindfulness meditation, and then how it relates to insight when we get to the next lecture, which is actually called Insight. That's the title of the next lecture. I'm very, very curious to see where he takes this.
Yeah, man. I think that. So, there is one thing I want to add at the end here, but
yeah.
Commenting on your. Yeah, I think the notion of the schema is interesting, and specifically, I'll comment that the notion of causal relationships and part-whole relationships. So it's not just, and that's kind of it's organizing the feature list into those different categories. Is what's the cause, what's the effect, and what things are parts of other things, right? And in what way? What is the Venn diagram maybe of these things, right? I think the really useful notion of kind of transitioning a feature list into an IDOS, right? Mm-hmm. It still misses a little bit of the participatory aspect, but it's in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was fascinating. I'll add one thing, and this is the Gibran quote, actually, I kind of was thinking about ending with. So we talked about this, or I was talking mostly, about this notion of savoring, right? Or paying attention. And the thing it reminded me of was Gibran's, he's got a whole poem in the Prophet on work, right? And he says that the key is to work with love, right? And that, so I'll just read it here, that life is darkness, save when there is urge, and urge is blind, save when there is knowledge, and knowledge is vain, save when there is work. And all work is empty, save when there is love. And when you work with love, you bind yourself and to one another and to God. And what is it to work with love? It is to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your heart, even as if your beloved were to wear the cloth. It is to build a house with affection, even as if your beloved were to dwell in that house. It is to sow seeds with tenderness and reap the harvest with joy, even as if your beloved were to eat the fruit. It is to charge all things you fashion with a breath of your own spirit. And one of the quote I love is, "Work is love made visible." The reason I go through all of that, which is, by the way, one of my favorite quotes ever. Sorry, and I'll read one additional, is that if you bake bread with indifference, you bake a bitter bread that feeds but half man's hunger. And if you sing though as angels and love not the singing, you muffle men's ears to the voices of the day and the voices of the night. And that notion of loving what you are doing, to me, comes very close to savoring, right? Is if you make coffee for someone you love, right? You make that coffee differently. You pay attention a little bit more, right? If you are making a present for someone, maybe you're a carpenter and you're building something for whatever. It's different if you're just marketing it. You're just putting it up on sale, right? But if you're making it for someone you love, then the attention you put into things is a bit different. And I think part of this notion of mindfulness is to just do everything as if you were motivated that way, right? To work with love is very, and work is to do maybe with love. If you're making espresso, if you're planning your vacation, if you're breathing, right? But to do things in that way that captivates you, where you are truly trying to do the best job you can do, right? I think that notion, to me, really captures something about the essence of not just mindfulness as a practice to enhance the rest of your life, but bringing mindfulness into every aspect of your life. And that kind of goes back once again to that quote we in lecture 2, I think I said, is, before enlightenment, fetch wood, carry water. After enlightenment, fetch wood, carry water, right? But it's the quality with which you are doing those things is
Right.
now you're not doing it distracted, you're doing it with love. You're doing it as with the enjoyment of the fetching of the wood and the carrying of the water, maybe, right? And I think that's a really unique and powerful way of being.
Yeah, it definitely makes the sense of meaning, it brings the sense of meaning into life, when it's done in a mindful way. I definitely feel that in my own experiences when I'm meditating a lot, I feel, a lot calmer. I bring focus and attention to, the most mundane things that I do. In fact, one of the things I've noticed when I meditate a lot is when I'm driving, I don't turn music on when I'm driving. Usually I'm listening to something all the time when I'm driving. And the reason I don't is then the song will get stuck in my head, and then when I'm meditating, the song keeps coming up. That happens quite often. I found when I'm meditating a lot, I listen to less music because I just don't want to have to contend with the song that's playing in my head, because that happens a lot, right? When I'm get into a song, it's in my head a lot, and then when I meditate, I see the song in my head all the time. And so one of the things I do is I don't listen to as much music. I just a natural organic thing that happens, because I don't need to be distracted while driving. The driving itself is pleasurable enough, right? I don't need to be distracted when I'm doing some mundane thing.
You can
like
just
cleaning
enjoy the
house or
driving, right?
whatever. Yeah, or cleaning the houses. I told you a lot of the times when I'm doing chores in the house, I listen to a podcast or something else,
Sure.
audiobook or whatever. And what I've told you often is I'm actually not cleaning. I'm actually listening to the podcast, and I happen to be cleaning something while I'm doing it, right? Whereas
Totally.
when I meditate a lot, I find that I compartmentalize. When I'm cleaning, I'm just cleaning. I'm not actually listening to anything. And when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm just listening to the podcast. I don't try to do. And I find it definitely enhances a sense of my life feeling more meaningful. Where I have always sort of fallen off the bandwagon is that when there is some big problem in life that I have to figure out, something that's bothering me, I tend to then meditate less, because then I am also deeply aware of and mindful of this giant problem. And the inner narrative that I become highly aware of becomes annoying. It's yes, I know. The voice in my head that is, torturing me, so to speak, with the problem that I have to think about is a lot, louder. And that's where, the mindfulness thing becomes difficult. And in fact, there's even a close friend of mine who, said, mindfulness is actually not for everyone. There are times where it's probably not a good idea to practice, the sitting down and listening, to your breath, because the voices that are tormenting you can get so loud, and it becomes so front and center that you don't want to be in that mode necessarily. Being that, that sense of that being mode is a little torturous, sometimes, because all there is in your sort of theater of being is just the tormenting sort of inner voice that is, telling you that, you've messed up here, or you haven't fixed this problem there, or whatever. So that's one thing that I don't think I've quite reconciled in my own head.
What's interesting is I agree that there are times you should not necessarily engage with mindfulness in some sense, though not at all for that reason, right? What I think is interesting is, again, I think there are times when you should be reactive, right? Imagine, I think that, and again, I think this is a misapplication, to be totally fair. So I think you could be mindful at all times in some sense. There's an error here I'll discuss. Is I think that some people, I'm upset, I'm anxious. Let me be mindful. Let me downregulate that upset. Let me not judge it. Let me, whatever, all of those things, right?
Yeah.
well, maybe you should be anxious. If you're about, if you're about to be eaten by a tiger, mindfulness is not the right answer, right? I mean, like, or mindful meditation is not the right answer. You should be mindful of running, right? Like, you can be very fully engaged with the process of running your ass off, right?
Or the idea of anger. Sometimes
exactly,
the right response is to be anger, to be
or
angry,
guilt or shame,
to be furious. Yeah.
Maybe you've done something that you should be ashamed of. Maybe you need to hold yourself accountable, right? So I mean, I think depending on how it's used, I think that those things can be a bit any tool can be misapplied, right? The other thing you said in terms of having a bigger problem, I think what I find, I guess what I find interesting about that is, and again, maybe I came to this naturally or through my parents or whatever, but like, I think I've always had an intuitive sense of when trying too hard was getting in the way. There's a point at which trying to have an insight prevents the insight. I need to understand this. Sometimes you just need to, I mean, we know this so many times in med school, you've absorbed as much as you're going to absorb. Studying more is not going to help you because you've absorbed as much as you can for the day. You've been studying for 12 hours. That's as much as your brain can take for the day. It's time to go, watch something stupid and do something else, right? To let that happen unconsciously, to let the unconscious mind process everything you've shoved into it, right? And there's an art, I think, to not doing, to doing less, trying less, right? And when I'm facing a big problem, I do think I have a practice almost of working on it, thinking about it, trying to figure out what to do, and then very intentionally doing less. Let me try less, right? So that insight can arise in that less effortful place. I'm not concentrate on the problem. Figure this out, figure it out, right? You figure it out by softening your view and stepping back, zooming out, and letting the insight manifest on some level. Again, with quoting the Matrix, right? Stop trying to hit me and hit me, right? There's a point at which you're just trying and the effort itself is interfering with success. And again, most martial arts have this, right? There's too rigid, there's too soft, there's somewhere in between where you have to engage but not try too hard, right? Music has that. So many different practices have that are meditative, right? And yeah, I think when I've faced really difficult problems in my life, that I don't know, I think I have a sense of when my effort is getting in the way.
Yeah, no, that's a new idea for me, to be honest. Yeah, because my approach has been just to try really hard, and then get yourself like caught, tied up in a knot to try to figure out the problem. The idea of just putting it on the back burner and letting it gestate, I suppose, is another way of thinking about it, is difficult for me, right? But already know I have a difficult time dealing with uncertainty, a difficult time dealing with unresolved issues, right? And so that's just my own personal hang-ups.
I think there's some element there that's interesting in that I trust my unconscious mind deeply. I really trust that it will do its best to find a solution. I'm going to help. I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to think about the problem a certain number of hours a day, right? And then I really trust that it's going to keep working while I go do something else. Like it's not really setting it on the back burner, because not all of my effort, and in fact maybe not the best part of my effort, is conscious. A lot of my effort is unconscious, right? I have now in the last few years, I think the best model I have is working out. Is you're not going to build muscle if you're in the gym 24 hours a day lifting and you don't sleep, right? The best part of that effort comes from, it's the combination. You're not going to build muscle if you don't go to the gym, right? But the rest actually is where the muscle is built. It's in the retreat. It's in the pulling back from effort, right? And so learning the middle path, right, is you have to go to the gym, you have to overload, you have to work hard, focus, put the effort in, and then stop, right? And in the stopping and trusting that your body will grow muscle the way it is supposed to, I don't know, I do think that sense of self-trust that, hey, yeah, you know what? I'm facing a big problem. I'm going to work on it. I'm not abandoning it, right? I'm not just floating away, ignoring it, whatever. I'm going to think about it, work on it, write about it, journal about it, but not 24 hours a day, right? I'll do that for an hour or two. And then the reason I'm able to leave it is I deeply trust that the problem is still being worked on, that the rest itself is doing work, just the same way building muscle, resting is doing work, right?
Sure.
That framework, I think, helps me a lot.
Yeah, well said. Okay. All right, dude. Anything else we need to go
Cool, man.
over?
No, I think that's good.
I
I think
for the next lecture.
Yeah, totally. We'll
All
pick
right,
it up
man.
again.
Good talk.
Cool.